Welcome to Chapter 3, where we're going to talk about psychopathology and biogenics of serial murders. So, we're going to start off with a very brief overview of criminology theory. For those of you that are CJ majors, you have learned a lot of this in criminology. Some early criminologists used what's called phrenology to determine criminal propensities. So phrenology was looking at the bumps and feeling the bumps on the skull and using that to predict personality traits and whether or not someone was likely to be a criminal offender. Now, Lombroso is also an early criminologist, and he notes that habitual criminals have weak natures, they're atavistic, and can be identified by physical attributes. Now, he mostly talks about male offenders, but what he means by atavistic is that some folks were what he calls born criminals. Okay, they're biologically predisposed. He's heavily influenced by Darwin, and he basically says that criminal offenders are less evolved humans. And when he talks about atavistic traits, he means ape-like traits. And there's a list of many of them, and if you had at least 5 of them, you were considered to be a born criminal. Now, they included things like a beak-like nose, supernumerary nipples, having your arm span. So if you put your arms out at your side, fingertip to fingertip, being more than your height. And a series of other traits. He also believed that these born criminals, what he called atavistic throwbacks, were cold and cruel, showed no remorse, retained no close friends, and were prone to sell out their accomplices. So he basically also talks about another category called the habitual offender, and he says they engage in crime because they have no choice. Now, so far, these have been disproven, both of those theories. Now, some other people looked at criminal families, and they wanted to figure out whether or not it was possible to inherit criminal traits or criminal propensities. And so they talk about different families and how in some of these families, in particular the Jukes, was a family that was studied quite a bit. Quite a few people had a criminal propensity. But what we're missing here is that when we look at criminal behavior within families, right, we have to take into account not just the role of our nature, our biology, but also of nurture, how we're raised. So to understand serial killers, we need to look at them from a variety of avenues. And indeed, childhood experiences are going to play a pivotal role in the development of violent behavior in general and for serial killers in particular. So Eisnick argues that criminal behavior, including homicide, stems from both the interactions of our environment and inherited personality traits. So for a long time, the debate was, is it nature, is it nurture? And now we understand that it's really how those two things interact. So it's possible to be born with maybe some traits that might make you more likely to be a criminal offender, but your environment could either, the way you're raised might either like soften those, or those effects might not show up, or the way you're raised could heighten those and really bring those traits out. Now, Eisenach also talks about extroverts versus introverts and says that there are biological differences in their nervous systems, and that's part of why, they're different. He also says that most people avoid antisocial behavior because they've been trained to recognize the negative consequences of it, right? So a thing that we talk about a lot is, is going to prison or jail a deterrent? And most of you guys would probably say, yeah, sure, I don't break the law because I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to go to prison. And certainly you don't. And believe me, if you haven't been to one, you definitely don't want to. However, there's probably other things actually playing a role, other consequences that are of greater concern to you. Now, one thing to think about here is, what is insanity, what is mental illness, and what roles do they play? So one thing we want to keep in mind is insanity is a legal term. Okay, you're not going to go to your doctor and they're not going to diagnose you as insane. It's not in the DSM. No medical professional is going to diagnose you this way. Okay, and it defines the state of mind of an offender at the time of the offense. Now, insanity usually has to have some connection to a mental illness piece. That's how it's mostly defined here in the US. But most serial killers do not have a history of mental illness. Now, one thing to keep in mind, right, is the way the public uses a lot of criminal justice terms is incorrect, right? So insanity gets thrown out. We'll say people are crazy. We say people are psycho or they're a psychopath without necessarily understanding what those things mean. Now, in terms of the insanity defense, less than 1% of cases even use the insanity defense, and most of those are unsuccessful. So this idea that a lot of people are quote unquote getting off on an insanity defense just isn't really supported by any evidence. It's just that because those cases are rare, you're likely to hear about them. Now, if you're found not guilty by reason of insanity, abbreviated here as NGRI, those offenders are usually placed in a psychiatric facility, and you're going to remain there until you're deemed safe to be back in the community. So it's not like by pleading or getting being found not guilty by reason of insanity is a benefit to you. Now, in Jones v. US, the Supreme Court held that insanity might continue after the criminal act. So maybe you're insane at the time the criminal act occurred, but you may still continue to legally be insane. So an offender could be placed in a psychiatric facility until they are determined to have recovered from their affliction. Okay, so how do we test for insanity in the US? We have 4 different tests, although the Durham rule isn't really used. We have the Monotone rule, which comes from England, the irresistible impulse test, the substantial capacity test, and the Durham rule. So the Monotone rule says at the time that you commit the crime, you're laboring under such a defective reason from a disease of the mind as to not know the nature and quality of the act you are doing. So you don't know what you're doing, you don't understand it. Or if you did know, that you didn't know what you were doing was wrong. Okay? So where we get tripped up with these is what, and we'll talk about this in a couple minutes, is what constitutes a disease of the mind. Now, the irresistible impulse test says the offender does understand the difference between right and wrong, but they have succumbed to uncontrollable impulses. And so the defense here only has to show that the offender could not control himself during the commission of the crime. Now, the Bronner rule is the substantial capacity test, and this is commonly used here in the US. And it combines elements from both of the 2 prior rules we just talked about, the Monotone rule and the irresistible impulse. So as a result of mental disease or defect, right, we saw that in the Monotone rule, you lack substantial capacity either to appreciate the wrongfulness of your act, also in the Monotone rule, or conform their conduct to the requirement of the law. And that comes from the irresistible impulse test. Now here, we only have to show a lack of substantial capacity as opposed to total impairment. But you couldn't use this if this is a repeated criminal behavior. Now, the Durham rule has really disappeared, mostly because John Hinckley, who attempted to assassinate President Reagan, was found not guilty by reason of insanity using this Durham rule. So this comes from a court case, and it says an accused is not criminally responsible if his unlawful act was the product of a mental disease or defect. Now, separate from the concept of insanity is the concept of competency. Okay, you need to be competent to stand trial. That usually means you have to be able to participate and aid in your own defense. Okay, so you have to be able to answer questions for your attorney, help them to prepare your case. Now, if you're found incompetent to stand trial, you're placed in a psychiatric institution until you are competent, and then you would be tried. Now, very few serial killers are found to be incompetent. So remember that what we're looking at here with these insanity definitions is mental illness, right? Mental disease or defect. And what you would have to look at is how the state in which your case is being tried defines mental disease or defect. But we've got psychosis, and then we've got a variety of dissociative disorders. So let's talk about these. Sorry, my TV just turned itself on. And I can't find my remote. All right, guys. Hopefully that's not too distracting, but I've already recorded 10 minutes, so I don't want to start over. Okay, so what is psychosis? Psychosis is where you have a break from reality in very specific ways. This could result in dangerous behavior. Okay, so the most recent DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, this is what psychiatrists, psychologists use to diagnose mental health disorders, is the DSM-5. And psychotic disorders include one or more of the following: delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior. And psychosis can be caused by several things. Okay, it could be a result of drug abuse, a brain injury, or a major mood disorder. Now, major mood disorders are also in the DSM and things with which you could be diagnosed. Now, usually someone who's having a psychotic break is at a greater risk to hurt themselves than anyone else. Now, it's easy to believe psychotic people are prone to kill others, but research says otherwise. So in a study that looked at cases from 1964 to 1973, only 1% of murderers were psychotic. Now, until recently, anyone who was psychotic was routinely transferred to an institution for the criminally insane, even if they hadn't committed a crime. So people who are quote unquote criminally insane often display few, if any, overt signs of mental illness. And again, remember, serial killers rarely found to be psychotic. Now, before transferring psychotic people to institutions for the criminally insane, we have to have administrative hearings. So we can't just send them there. Now, there's 4 different dissociative disorders we'll talk about as well, okay? So dissociative identity disorder used to be called multiple personality disorder, okay? And it's the development of 2 or more distinct personalities that each have their own memories, thoughts, and emotions. Now, a primary subpersonality can suddenly dominate a person's thinking and behavior. So it can be very dramatic if you watch someone switch between personalities. Women are diagnosed with this disorder 3 times as often as men, and some argue that DID is iatrogenic, which basically means that practitioners and clinicians are responsible for its occurrence. Now, DID may be an attempt to suppress or deny severe trauma as a child, may allow the child to have maybe a different personality that experiences the abuse to cut the main personality off from that experience, maybe a coping mechanism. Those who do seem to develop DID seem to be particularly impressionable, highly suggestible, and can be readily hypnotized. And while others feel like, oh, a change in personality is really just a shift in mood. Now, DID is rare, but highly publicized among serial killers. Now, Kenneth Bianchi is one of the Hillside Stranglers, him and his cousin, and he attempted to fake DID, which we mentioned in the previous chapter. While he was being examined, Dr. Allison told Bianchi that it was rare to only have 2 personalities. So then when she hypnotized him, or he hypnotized him, Bianchi suddenly has another personality. And this is basically how they caught him malingering or faking. So there aren't well-documented cases of DID with serial killers, but there is sort of this belief that that's what's happening. Now, dissociative amnesia is also sometimes called psychogenic amnesia. And it's a loss of memory due to psychological rather than organic, like a brain injury, reasons. It's rare, but it can be triggered by highly stressful events such as trauma. Those afflicted tend to display anterograde amnesia, so they lose memory after the traumatic event. Now, a third dissociative disorder is dissociative fugue. And this is an extreme form of dissociative amnesia. It's a sudden, unexpected travel away from home or one's customary place of work with an inability to recall one's personal identity or past history. They could basically have developed a whole new personality. They might have a new job, not a personality, sorry, a new identity. Only about 2% of the population has had this experience. Now, the last dissociative disorder is depersonalization, derealization. This is feeling detached from your mental processes or physical body. And this can, of course, cause significant impairment in social or occupational functioning. Now, thinking about other types of psychology, mental health issues, we have Freud, right? So Freud talks about the id, ego, and superego. And the id is our primal forces. It's the I want, I need part of you, right? It's the part of you that wants to eat chocolate cake in the morning, okay? The superego is our conscious. It sits in judgment of our behavior. And the ego is what develops from birth and guides us in following rules. So basically, your id is like, I really, really want to do this. And your superego is like, yo, chill, that's not going to happen. Now, violent people appear to give very little attention to morality or ethics or standards once their id has been aroused. So, for instance, Henry Lee Lucas stabbed a girl repeatedly when she slapped him. So I had a client before who was on probation, and one of the crimes he had committed before was he had stabbed a 9-year-old girl. And when I asked him why he stabbed her, he said that she called him a bad word. So then he called her the C word. And then he stabbed her. Right? So, and he thought, by the way, that this is a completely reasonable reaction. Like, how dare she? So abnormal behavior, according to Freud, is a product of a conflict between our human needs and societal norms. So Edmund Kemper, serial killer, experiences significant childhood conflict with his mother and eventually kills his mother and decapitates her. And this led him to believe that he had resolved that conflict once and for all. By the way, these are not appropriate conflict resolution skills. Now, most seriously violent offenders, besides serial killers, suffer from various forms of personality disturbances. And many are the products of psychotic households that are filled with violent behavior. Some have also suffered neurological damage, and that could be a result of head injuries or seizure disorders. Now, for serial killers, frustration is a common theme. Okay. Sex becomes a vehicle to vent that frustration, anger, hate, and fear. And many serial killers we know derive sexual gratification from watching their victims suffer and die, even if they don't sexually assault them. Now, the DSM also has a series of what's called personality disorders. Okay. Personality disorders do not qualify, right? If the underlying mental disease or defect is a personality disorder, you're not eligible for the insanity plea. Okay. That's not part of insanity. Personality disorders are not allowed. Okay. So these are enduring patterns of inner experience and outward behavior that impairs the sense of self, emotional experiences, goals, capacity for empathy, and or intimacy. Now, today's psychologists tend to focus on like the big 5 personality traits, these super traits: neuroticism, extroversion, openness to experiences, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. Now, for personality disorders, we're talking about some substantial overlap amongst different personality disorders, right? So basically, it manifests in 2 or more of the following ways. In terms of our cognition, so how we perceive and interpret ourselves, other people, and events. Affectivity, right? This is the appropriateness of our emotional response, our interpersonal functioning, and our impulse control. So let's look at some personality disorders. So paranoia, which is a pervasive distrust and suspiciousness of others. We have schizoid and schizotypal personality disorders. The one that's going to be most important for us, generally speaking, looking at serial killers, is antisocial personality disorder. This is more than just when we say so-and-so is antisocial and we mean like, oh, they're not a social butterfly. We mean they're an introvert, right? Antisocial personality disorder is an extreme disregard and violation of the rights of others. Borderline personality disorder, you'll notice a lot of these are going to talk about impairments in terms of interpersonal relationships. And I'll let you review these couple of other ones on your own in your reading. But as far as obsessive compulsive disorder goes, this is a preoccupation with orderliness, perfectionism, mental and interpersonal control. and inflexible and inefficient behaviors. And there's some people who have argued that because serial killers tend to have, a particular MO, that they might have some elements of obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, personality disorders are very resistant to change. In fact, ASPD is, we don't have any known treatment that works for antisocial personality disorder, or not part of the DSM, but more commonly used in the legal system, psychopathy. In fact, therapy makes them better at being antisocial, okay? This is common amongst violent offenders. It includes a history of antisocial behavior beginning no later than age 15 for males and during the teens for females. Now, we generally don't diagnose minors as being psychopaths or having ASPD. We tend to diagnose them with a conduct disorder. So antisocial behavior includes things like incorrigibility, theft, fighting, deceitfulness, reckless regard for the safety of self or others, impulsivity, and aggressive behavior. As adults, folks with ASPD have difficulty developing and sustaining relationships. They tend to have poor work habits, lack responsibility, view the world in negative and hostile terms, and show lack of insight into their problems and future plans. So this is really what we tend to see with serial killers: aggressive, hostile behavior, and a tendency to avoid developing close relationships. Now, some serial killers seem to be well-adjusted, and they seem to lead normal lives, right? We'll hear from somebody who's like, oh my God, I'm so surprised. He was like the nicest guy. And some just may never reveal enough of themselves in daily life to allow us to identify a personality disorder. Now, we can look at this definition of antisocial personality disorder and be like, yo, I know so many people who probably have this, okay? But you actually have to have spent a great deal of time with someone to really see that this is what's going on. Now, one place we see this is what's called the trolley problem. And you guys might have talked about this if you've taken ethics. We've got a runaway trolley. It's traveling at a high speed towards a train station, okay? And on one path, there's 5 people at the train station, right, that are going to get run over. But if we push a large man off a bridge into the trolley's path, the man will die, but the 5 others will be spared. So what do you do, right? Now, some might say push the man off the bridge. And most serial killers would probably say push the man off the bridge. Other people might be like, oh, what if I have the option to flip a switch that will divert the train and spare the 5, but kill a man on the diverted track? Those with antisocial personality disorder would not see any problem in pushing a large man and sacrificing 1 person versus 5 people. Now, some other disorders that get talked about but aren't necessarily related to serial killing is autism spectrum disorders, right? So in the past, we would diagnose people as autistic and then a series of other things like you might be familiar with Asperger's. But today they talk about autism spectrum disorders, and that people basically, it's a range or continuity of behaviors, and people fall in different places on this. Okay, so these are pervasive developmental disorders where people have a tendency for isolation, repetitive thinking and behaviors, a pattern of actively rejecting other people's worldviews. As I mentioned, the DSM has dropped the Asperger's, which used to really be talked about as like a high functioning form of autism, which isn't really a fair and accurate description of what's happening with autism. And so now we have autism spectrum disorder and then social communication disorders. Now, we first have to talk about psychopaths, right, as separate from ASPD, although they're fairly similar, right? In this book by Cleckley called The Mask of Sanity, and he talks about 16 characteristics of psychopaths. They tend to be intelligent, rational, calm, unreliable, and insincere, although it may take you a while to realize they're insincere. So they have a tendency to say the right things. You're looking for that lack of affect that's appropriate. They tend to not experience shame or remorse, right? We hear a lot about they lack empathy. They have poor judgment, unemotional, indifferent to others, suicidal, lack long-term goals, just to name a few. So psychopath is not a diagnostic label. You're not going to go to your doctor and your doctor's not going to diagnose you as psychopath. It's kind of like insanity. It's more used in terms of the legal system. Although there is a way of diagnosing someone as a psychopath. But it refers to individuals determined by societal standards to possess characteristics at variance with general community standards. So it's routinely applied erroneously. Folks who are psychopaths are aggressive and sensitive, but charismatic, irresponsible, intelligent, dangerous, hedonistic, narcissistic, and antisocial. They can masterfully explain someone else's problems and what they have to do to overcome them, but they don't have that same insight into their own problems. They're exceptional at manipulating people. So what we see most psychopaths do is most psychopaths are not violent, but they take the most expedient route to accomplish their goals. So they will step right on top of somebody, push somebody out of the way, both literally and figuratively, to get what they want. They lack remorse. Now, most of them are nonviolent. And in fact, the place where you're going to see most of them is in white collar crime and in business and in the military. Okay. Now, they commonly engage in risky behaviors because winning the game is everything. They also tend to be driven by narcissism and they have a need for stimulation. So, a lot of times they might be understimulated. And so, this is why they engage in risky behavior. They're often indifferent to suffering. They cannot relate to language that's emotionally laden. So they've done these brain images, right, where they'll show people words or images, right? And when we think of certain things, we might be thinking about things that are emotional and it lights up a certain part of our brain. Well, when you say those same things to someone who's a psychopath or has antisocial personality disorder, that part of the brain isn't going to light up. But it does light up when you show them really messed up stuff. Now, in order to get by, they tend to mimic emotions that they don't feel. So they tend not to feel sorrow, guilt, remorse, shame, or pain, but they know how to mimic it. And this is why you really have to either be quite skilled and working with this type of clientele or know somebody and really observe them over a long period of time to see this. But 1% of the population can be classified as psychopaths. So that's about 3 million psychopaths in the US. And as I mentioned, their brains seem to be understimulated. So we diagnose them using this thing called Hare's PCL, which is the psychopathy checklist, and the R means revised. Okay, and there's 2 dimensions to this. It's basically a series of traits that a professional person who's appropriately trained would look at. And if you score a 30, you're considered a psychopath. So it includes things like glibness, grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, conning and manipulative behavior, lack of remorse. As I mentioned, that shallow affect, callousness, lack of empathy, and failure to accept responsibility for your actions. Now, the second factor talks about, again, that need for stimulation, that they tend to be parasitic. They have poor behavioral controls and early behavioral problems. So they've done these studies where they ask early childhood education teachers, who do you think is going to be a problem? And teachers can usually point this out when they're very young. They are impulsive and irresponsible. And I mean the kind of impulsive, like you have a thought and you're already acting on it. Now, primary or advanced psychopaths tend to be above average to highly intelligent. They can beat the polygraph because they don't have a polygraph isn't measuring whether or not you're lying. It's measuring what happens to your body when you lie, right? So it's measuring your skin conductivity, your heart rate, your perspiration. And so they're very calm, right? They are antisocial and compulsive liars. Now, I do want to say there were some slides in here, and your book talks about the difference between psychopaths and sociopaths, and that's a bullshit distinction. I think sociologists like to hang on to that idea of sociopaths, but that's bullshit. We don't need to know that distinction. Now, they tend to be in certain jobs. So take a look at this list. CEOs. So list A to the left is the most number of psychopaths, and list B is the least. CEOs, lawyers, media, salesperson, police officer, clergy person, care aide, nurse, therapist, craftsperson, teacher, doctor, accountant. Now, as I mentioned, we do not diagnose children as psychopaths, okay? But early childhood maltreatment can significantly increase the risk of mental illness and therefore psychopathy. As I mentioned, children are diagnosed with what's called conduct disorder. But there has been some research that says children that do have those traits, right? Again, we're not going to actually diagnose them as a psychopath. They might be deficient in their automatic, unconscious processing of certain fear cues. So, in short, at risk youth may have a fundamental impairment that blocks them from recognizing social dangers. Now, it is possible for women to be serial killers, but the PCLR was developed on institutional population, so it's designed for prisoners, criminal justice population, and men. So, female serial murders do appear to exhibit some of those same traits. The women tend to be insincere, amoral, and impulsive, prone to manipulative charisma and superficial charm, without conscious and with little insight because they fail to learn from their mistakes.